Well, hello and welcome. This is Being Paleoconservative's new podcast. I'm admin from the page B, and with me is fellow admin BK. And we'll be talking about the differences between paleoconservatism and liberalism or libertarianism, as a lot of people tend to get confused. And it's an easy mistake to make, as they're similar enough, but there are differences, and we'll hopefully be able to explain them today.
Yeah, for sure. We get a lot of libertarians on the page who come in and have the impression that it's basically the same general idea, which it kind of is, but it's just under a different name, which is incorrect. So what we're going to do for the inaugural podcast is to explain that there are differences and that they are very prominent, and there's a lot of similarities as well. So we'd like to hit on those, and we'd like to hit on the differences, and hope that it's very informative for both of us as well as for the listeners.
Yes, well, I guess we'll start with the differences now. One of the big differences is on trade. Libertarians and liberals tend to be big fans of free trade, and that's pretty much the main point of difference. Most paleoconservatives are protectionists, and liberals are free traders.
Yeah, they're big fans of the Austrian school and the Chicago school to an extent, as far as free trade goes between nations. And paleoconservatives, are more along the lines of protecting the nation's jobs through tariffs and other forms of taxing incoming trade, so as to produce within the nation instead of outsourcing.
Yeah, that's it. So when liberals get shocked when Trump talks about imposing his 25% tariff on China, they go, "What? He's a fake conservative. He's just not a liberal." Tariffs are no new thing for half of the conservatives. Pat Buchanan advocated for similar stuff. Ross Perot advocated for similar stuff. So by no means is it a shocking new call. It's just not a neoconservative thing or a liberal thing.
Sure. He gets addressed as either a neoconservative or, quite frankly, a progressive on occasion. But he is hated by both of those groups. I would say neocons a little more, but
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so.
So of anything, Trump's probably more of a paleo. And, it flares up every now and then in the 90s with Ross Perot. I wasn't really around for that. I was born in 97,
I'm only probably a few months older than you are, so.
But, so it's a golden era to look back on.
Kind of nostalgia with that. And Trump's positions do emulate Buchanan's on several fronts.
And Buchanan's endorsed him almost more than anyone's endorsed any candidate. Even though, what was it in 2000? He called Pat a neo-Nazi or something.
Yeah, he was not a fan.
And Pat's just... No, but
exactly.
Pat's a fan of his.
Exactly.
That's good enough for me.
I'll take it now. His during the Reform Party, when the Reform Party was kind of collapsing into itself, Trump had issues with David Duke, and he had issues with Pat Buchanan, and as I understand, several other candidates in the party. Yeah. So he was not a fan of Buchanan back then, but Buchanan loves him both on his own website as well as the American Conservative. magazine.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So
yeah, that's one of the main points of difference in free trade, and there's there may be arguments for both. That's sort of one of the core tenets of paleoconservatism.
yeah,
So if you want to understand the ideology, you've got to
exactly.
accept
Yeah.
that. So other than trade, another point of difference, it sort of flows in, is
Yeah,
immigration.
that's a big one, for sure.
So, yeah, paleos like you and I certainly favour a strong border. The Trump-style or Cruz-style reforms appeal to me a lot, and they do to a lot of paleoconservatives. See, Pat, while he did endorse Trump, he's also a big fan of the Cruz style.
Yeah, that's one of the few
border
things he
reforms.
actually likes about Ted Cruz is the border discussion, the border reforms. So yeah, that's a big one. I mean, I back in my open borders, but I mean, it's a culture clash that is something that societies just aren't ready for, especially from third world nations like Mexico or the Middle East. And Mexico really shouldn't be in that position, but they are because they haven't followed the same path that the United States has, and not like they were ever really going to. But at the same time, there's a culture clash that's to be expected between two different cultures coming into each other through an open border.
Yes, exactly. And Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott, he wasn't really a paleo. He's a bit more of a neocon, but he was pretty solid on illegal immigration here. So while the US isn't fortunate like Australia to have an ocean as its border, we were able to just
From Cuba,
stop the boats. You don't really have boats coming, but oh, true. But he said something I remember along the lines of, if we just open the border, there's literally millions of people who would want to come to Australia, like hundreds of millions of people from all the poor islander countries who, well, I don't hold anything against them. They're dirt poor and they just want to better their lives, but if we just let all the millions of people who want to come here
like them to
to
have a better
actually come
life, but the
here,
reality of the
it would
situation
destroy
is,
Australia.
That's just not a good idea looking at the grand scheme of things. It's kind of like what Pat Buchanan used to say, and I'm paraphrasing here. It would be taking a large amount of Somalis and just throwing them into a county in Pennsylvania and expecting that to go over well. It just wouldn't, you know. So yeah, I mean,
Exactly.
like border issues and immigration issues, illegal or legal, are big issues for paleos, and that's a main difference between libertarians. Ann Coulter, I'm not sure if she's really all that paleo, but she has spoken out against legal immigration right now. she really is. Her and Milo Yiannopoulos are very edgy
She's
folks.
just edgy.
I think she kind of has a point. The United States, I don't know about Australia, but the United States has always had amnesty periods, or not amnesty periods, excuse me, kind of areas where they stop immigration for a little bit, just so that the immigrants can kind of they can come into a culture easier, kind of assimilate a little better, rather than just full on continuous immigration, legal or not. So.
We've got obviously long periods before they can become a citizen. I think it's you've got to be pretty much a permanent resident for 5 years before you can get citizenship. So I guess that helps with some assimilation. But we don't have any amnesty equivalent here. We sort of have offshore processing where illegal immigrants will be intercepted via boats and taken offshore, and they'll either stay there to be processed or go home.
That's an easier way. I don't believe there's a full-on way to screen everybody without issues, but that's an easier,
Australia,
probably a more effective way, safer way.
They come through legitimate
allowing people in and kind
methods.
of seeing what happens, even if they come the legal way.
Yes. Yeah. Australia's got UKIP's Farage would also always cite, as he wanted to do the legal immigration reform, he'd always cite the Australian-style point system. So when you want to immigrate to Australia, we've got a point system. So you get points for being qualified in like a trade. If you've studied like engineering and stuff, so if you're qualified if you have skills, that gives you points, and you need to meet a certain number of points to be allowed in.
Yeah, that's a good.
So
I mean,
a lot of people
you can't
like
have
that system
doing what Europe is doing and
because
Angela Merkel is doing.
We've got a pretty rigorous
just
screening
importing
process
people
as well.
who will live off the welfare.
You've not only got to be skilled,
you want
also
people who have
be a
skills who
criminal
can kind of contribute to the economy and earn their due.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's
even in Australia, most I forget the stat, but it's somewhere around 60% who've been like here over 12 months.
And that's a very, very similar statistic.
They don't have a very
the
good
United States
integration
as well
rate
with their illegal immigrant.
Where they come here and get a job. They just
obviously, it changes between like
here
East Asian immigration,
don't get a
European
job, and don't really
immigration,
integrate,
Latin American immigration,
that causes all sorts of problems.
or African immigration. But that's a very important thing to look at when it comes to immigration. Is there going to be a contribution, or is it going to be a taxpayer's burden, if you will, to kind of sustain these people with no reward from it for the society at large, really.
Yeah, exactly. And at the end of the day, it'll come down to the question, do we want you here? Are you more burden than positive? And these are all important questions. Like, it's no nation's responsibility to take any immigrant in. It's actually a very generous thing for a nation to allow people to come here. And you've just got to ask yourself the question, will you benefit the average Australian or American's life? And if the answer is no, we probably don't want you. And that's my attitude, and that's one shared by a lot of paleoconservatives, and one that is quite counter to libertarians who say, I think it is a responsibility perhaps to
and I know we're talking about the differences between libertarians and paleocons right now,
also work cheap,
a difference between
goods for
kind of
lower cost,
diverging from the conversation here is a difference between paleocons and maybe even libertarians on this one with leftists or progressives. Is it's actually cheaper to say relocate a Syrian refugee back home in the Middle East. It costs a lot less, and it's more efficient. Like, it's not going to cause as many problems for if you're going to resettle somebody in the United States. It costs taxpayers more to resettle them here. But the left wants to be on the moral high ground and say, let's bring them here, regardless of what the smart decision would be, which would be resettle them back home. And that's not only smart for us, but it's also smart for them.
I mean, the less you take out of their area is the better. Like, it's sort of the opposite. Like, you know what Trump says about illegals crossing the border from Mexico? You know, they're not sending their best and brightest. It's sort of the opposite with refugees. We are taking their best and brightest. We don't want people who never integrate. We don't want
especially
rapists,
since they have enough
issues
with their society over there as it is.
We want the people who
kind of take those people out.
Have skills.
I mean, all of those people
we
out.
want their smartest.
It doesn't do them any good.
Arguably, it does more damage by taking those
people
kind
of the way they are, from an economic standpoint. Yeah. That's right.
Yeah, exactly. And at the end of the day, the third world will stay the third world unless they have those people we're taking to pioneer greatness or whatever. So immigration is a very big differing point. It's probably the most major point of difference, because it is very important to the ideology. We might disagree on different issues. Like,
that is a very
I know
big
some
issue,
paleocons are pro-abortion, and some
abortion
are
and euthanasia. I think are topics that need to be discussed.
Illegal immigration,
but they're more of
legal immigration, is
they have
really
tendencies to be more of individual issues and don't affect society as a whole in the same way that immigration does. Exactly.
They're big issues to religious folk like me, but there are atheists.
I think that's fairly
in every
objective.
Political ideology, and
I mean, you can debate its
atheists
outcomes.
Don't have much of a moral issue with it.
But I mean, it's obvious that it affects a society, especially from
immigration's an issue to
cultures,
everyone.
non-Western, like industrial nations. Yeah.
And I guess another point of difference is in paleoconservatism, one of the most core parts is the focus on tradition, on values, on family, and all of that business. So, like when Peter Hitchens talks about how modern conservatives, they'll talk about traditional values at election time and then not actually do anything about it when they have the power. They'll often have a lot of neoliberalism about them when it comes to the economy. He's talking about the neocons. We haven't really seen a paleocon leader.
In the United States,
Trump's pretty much the closest thing we've
Planned
had
Parenthood.
Ever.
Just like my own personal opinion on Planned Parenthood is, I don't really care if they exist, but they shouldn't be receiving taxpayer money. And somebody like Ted Cruz, somebody like Donald Trump, I feel they would actively pursue defunding them and kind of standing up for the family in that way, hopefully past election time. But I mean, just a neocon perspective has not done any good for the situation. They haven't really they haven't tried to do anything. It's not an issue for them. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, neocons like Jeb Bush will talk about how awful Planned Parenthood is, but if, God forbid, he were elected president, I don't think he'd ever have done anything about it. While Scott Walker, I think, is still a neocon,
Yeah.
Abortion was very much a core issue for him, and I have no doubt he would have defunded it. Like, he practically made it legal in Wisconsin. So yeah, he's solid on that one, but perhaps not solid on everything. But yeah, I think Trump and Cruz would actively pursue defunding it, because a lot of Americans are religious. Even people who aren't religious some don't like abortion, and
and it's hard.
Basically,
I feel like it's so difficult for people
shouldn't have to pay for it. Like, if you don't believe in
think
it,
of
or
a
even
of
if
a
you
world without
abhor
Planned
it,
Parenthood
you're still
paid by
forced
the
to pay for it at the
taxpayers.
moment.
It shouldn't have to. I mean, it's not that complicated to say.
That's just
it can
morally
survive through
problematic.
private funding. I know celebrities love it. I know Mark Zuckerberg, I believe, has donated money to it. So it can be privately funded, and people just don't understand that, especially on the left.
Yeah, I think it has a pretty high
That's for
profit
sure.
margin. I'm not sure on that, but obviously with taxpayer funds, I'm not sure how the profits would look without subsidy, but apparently they do all right as a business. I mean, a lot of people
They
get
do.
abortions.
They do.
And that, while it isn't the only service they offer, like,
Yeah.
I do agree with Trump that they do some good things, like they do look after women's health, but they also kill babies. So I think it should be defunded, but not necessarily shut down. Like some people call for the shutting down, but
Yeah, so I think this
I
is
think
a position that we can
they
kind
do
of
good
agree with
things. Like, even
libertarians
if you
on,
banned
especially
abortion,
as it pertains to
Planned Parenthood
Planned
would not
because they're
be
a
horribly
lot. I mean, very similar kind of things for
made
small
useless or
government
anything.
with kind of limited programs that can only do so much. And Planned Parenthood is an example of big government taking taxes away from the American taxpayer without regards to, if they feel it's morally detrimental to do so. And they agree with us that, yeah, this should be privately funded. I don't know if most paleocons take the position of, I know we can't get rid of it altogether, but we should at least try to move it away from the taxpayer. But I mean, like, their overall stance on abortion, I feel, changes from person to person. It's pretty solid for most paleoconservatives and conservatives in general to be pro-life. Libertarians tend to be different on that stance.
Yes, true.
Yeah.
I guess we sort of, for different reasons, but we do agree on that, like small governments, another core tenet, I think, and that obviously is for classic liberalism and for libertarianism. So I guess we agree. We'll agree with them on most matters like that. I think most paleoconservatives are for limited government and for free enterprise, but just not for free trade. So I suspect if you mapped on the economy where most paleocons believe in and where most libertarians believe in, you'll find very similar views on
that's one of the big
regulation
differences too.
And taxes. But
I feel kind of
you'll find
as you go further down the spectrum,
the differences will come on
to
trade,
side,
not
left
on
or
the
right.
actual
You find
domestic
more,
economy.
I mean, kind of on the anarchist side of libertarianism, it's all about the market. It's all about free trade. It's all about open borders. Not a huge fan of law enforcement or religion, for that matter. But I mean, like that's kind of an example of just extreme differences between the anarchists, the ANCAPs, if you will, and the and paleoconservatives and some libertarians as well. Yeah, and definitely emphasis on family is more of a family and tradition is more of a paleoconservative standpoint. I've never really heard of libertarians discussing family. I'm not sure if it's different for you, if you've heard any of that. Mm.
No, the sense I get is family's not too important to them because, at the end of the day, most of them aren't Christian. And I guess it is quite a Christian thing to want a wife and, lots of kids. But that's just not really as much of a libertarian thing. I know a lot of them find the double income, no kids model very appealing, because it's so much money, and they'd find that filling.
And I don't think it's an innately
difference in that way.
You say the word
that they do
Christian
that ideology
thing to want to have
doesn't
a family,
have the same
but
core
you
Christian
find
values
conservative
that
circles
the conservative
and
ideologies have.
More Christians, I would say, kind of dedicated to that noble dedication to wanting those things and understanding that a strong family makes for a strong nation. And libertarians, I feel, don't really look at it that way. I can't speak for the whole group in general, but you're definitely right. Faith is not as big of a factor for a libertarian, and even some of our admins would probably disagree with us on this stance, for sure.
Yeah, they probably, I'm sure they would. But no, I'd say even though a lot of conservatives aren't Christian, I'd definitely argue at the core of the ideology is Christian values. You don't necessarily have to be Christian to believe in that, but I'd say at its core, it is based on Christian values of,
and as it goes for religion in general, whether it be Christianity or not,
tradition.
Libertarians take kind of a live and let live attitude towards it. They don't necessarily care, and they look for more libertarian solutions, while we're kind of on the traditionalist side of kind of looking back with how we've established, just with how roles have been established in the past, and how we can look back to Christianity especially and see where that's given the United States advantages. Any really Western nation, any first world Western nation. And we definitely oppose cultural, social, and religious degeneration. And they're kind of, they don't really care about that kind of thing. No.
Yeah, and libertarians they differ with us a lot on the social policies. They're not conservative socially, and that's just a simple way to put it. There, just socially, they differ with us a lot. I mean, some paleocons won't really care about gay marriage. I do, but that's a difference. Another difference. It's not.
Yeah, so I guess
one
one point where you and I would disagree, I suppose,
certainly
on gay marriage
on
is,
abortion,
I kind of take Ron
gay
Paul's,
marriage,
Rand Paul's
even
position.
views on divorce and stuff.
And he had said
will
this
be
in one
very
of the
different.
debates. I don't want my guns or my marriage registered in Washington. I don't necessarily care. I have issues with the Pride movement, for sure. I think a lot of them have slipped into absolute degeneracy. But I don't have an issue with gay marriage as long as it doesn't come into my church, or even that of my neighbor's church. I think it should just be an individual contract kind of thing, which is a very libertarian position on it. I think the states should decide about it. But, unfortunately, that's kind of a fantasy world we're living in now after the Supreme Court ruling last summer.
Yeah, I agree with Rand. I think the way the world's moving, unfortunately, I think gay marriage, I'm starting to come around that I think gay marriage is a when, not an if. And the best that a lot of the time we can hope for is just deregulation, and even deregulation of marriage isn't a bad result. Ideally, I like the status quo, but I wouldn't fight deregulation. It appeases everyone.
So
and if it's deregulated,
I think we've
it
hit
avoids
most
all
of
the
differences.
Trying to force
I suppose another
businesses
one
to
would be
marry them also for their wedding. So I'm quite favourable to a deregulation
I'm not really
as well.
sure on what most paleoconservatives, I believe, would regard drug legalization as kind of a bad thing. For me personally, I take a little more of a libertarian stance on this one, or really a federalist position. Kind of the state should decide, especially as it pertains to marijuana. But as far as other legal drugs or illegal drugs go, libertarians are, for the most part, hardline on full-on legalization.
Yes, I know that is quite an important thing to libertarians. I haven't really heard Pat Buchanan or anyone talk about the war on drugs and stuff, but I know. Obviously, Buchanan was a senior advisor to Nixon. Nixon obviously started the war on drugs.
Yeah.
I don't know if what Pat's view on it is, or other prominent paleos is, but the impression I get is it's just not a core issue at all for us. Personally, I don't really care about it. I think doing drugs is degenerate, but I don't really care about it. It's the same as people who have lots of sex outside of marriage. I just don't really care. But I lean towards. I just find. It's a bit
I don't really
edgy
care,
to say, but I find the war on drugs a bit funny. When you listen to the Nixon tapes and he talks about hitting marijuana. Really
we
hard,
follow so many libertarian
solid.
pages as well. I wouldn't say we have necessarily a close relationship, but we have a close following on pages like Being Classically Liberal, Being Libertarian, pages like that. Unbiased America to an extent. Just these pages. That's a talking point for a lot of libertarian folks. Um, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them probably do drugs.
right.
Like, unironically, they do. I mean, I don't, and I don't hang out with people who do drugs, as most of my friends are, regular church-going Christians. So I just don't have friends with a culture like that. But a lot of these people who don't have a moral opposition to it
Yeah.
either do drugs themselves or have friends who do, and they think, they see it for
Right.
themselves. Like, they don't see any harmful effects in themselves, and they think, it's fine. People shouldn't go to jail for it. And the reason I don't really care about it is because it's zero part of my life. The only time I think about the war on drugs is when I see people internet arguing about it. So, I guess it's just a difference in the culture. And not to be rude, or anything in that, but
Yeah.
I'd say that is a big part. A lot of them have drugs as
this was
at least
discussed
a small
a little
part
bit
of their life through a
at the
friend doing
Republican
it or
debates
whatever, so
last
they're
last
exposed
year.
to it more
They haven't really discussed
than
it
me.
too much this year, I think, just because
So I
Rand
just don't really
has been
care.
out of it. But Rand is in stark contrast to people like Chris Christie on drug legalization. He takes a fairly federalist position like his dad does, but it's not really a talking point for conservatives, just because most conservatives, it's not something they do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Mm.
He does. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't affect their lives. But I don't mind. Rand actually makes good arguments on it. Like, there are solid arguments for it, but again, I just don't really care that much about it. Rand, like, while he's not a paleo, he appealed to me on a lot of things. Like, he did share.
Yeah.
He shares, like, values with us. I guess another similarity between us and the Liberals is that they support an isolationist, or a more isolationist foreign policy. So when Rand Paul talks about stricter, checks on Syrian refugees and saying that we should get out of the Middle East, or we should
kind of
be
very
more
critical of the
cautious
American
in
Empire,
any more involvement, that
as
sort
it's
of
been
thing.
in terms of interventionism bases.
Exact sort of thing Pat Buchanan's
a ton
been
of
saying.
countries.
It's the
It
same
kinda
thing that
shouldn't
Trump
be.
says.
But I mean, interventionism is a huge talking point that we can both groups can agree upon, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess we can finish up around here, but a final thing is when the Republican race first kicked off last year, I can remember pretty much all the admins were behind Rand Paul before Trump had announced he was running. Even when he did, I just thought he was a joke. But I was very pro Rand Paul at the beginning. He just, even like you explained, his position on drugs is a bit counter to mine. Even his position on gay marriage is a bit different to mine. I still liked him a lot because on foreign policy he was really solid, and I remember he's the only candidate that actually cared about, like, infrastructure at home.
Yeah.
He'd say something like, and paraphrasing here, he'd say like, we're sending billions overseas.
It's something we forget about a
while
lot,
bridges are
especially
falling
in political
down at
discussion.
home.
It just doesn't come up a lot of talking
No other
points
candidate would say anything like that and talk about
the left kind of starts,
infrastructure,
I'll blame it
which
on
is
them, but
that's important to me. I don't know about you, but I thought that was really
those things
solid.
kind of come up, and then on the right, it's like economic stuff, it's foreign policy stuff, and kind of in the middle, there's not a whole lot of domestic policy being talked about between the two. Yeah.
Yeah, it's weird. Like here in Australia, infrastructure is always a huge part of the election discussion. It might become more important as the election rolls closer. I don't know, but in Australia, it's always a big issue. Like one of the core promises last election was to build
for sure.
2 major roads in each, or a major road in our 2 largest cities. To ease congestion, because infrastructure is one of those real basic things that government can do to make people's lives better. So I suppose we can.
Yeah, that would hopefully, as we continue to grow as a page and get some more input,
and perhaps next
our listeners
time around we can get a guest in.
We'll be able to do
from a different ideology and
some
discuss
more perspectives on the show.
Debate and issue.
Next week around this time, we'll be having different admins on discussing differences between and similarities between the alt-right and paleoconservatives. So
yeah, that sounds interesting. So I guess if you're listening and you have any feedback, I suspect we'll be putting this on YouTube, so you could leave it in the comments there, or we'll share it on the page, and you can leave a comment on the page post or message the page or anything really, and we'll try to read as much as we can. Alright. Thank you, BK.